Ellie Chowns, I'll start with you. You have 2 minutes with your opening statement.
Thanks, Curtis. Thanks for having me on. It's really good to be here. This leadership election does offer a choice between going back to what we did in the old days or building on the really successful strategy that we've had in recent years, focusing our efforts, making sure that we get people elected, and through that, being the strongest possible green voice for people in this country. And oh my goodness, isn't that needed? We've shown through our work as four MPs in Parliament over the last year just how important it is to have more Green MPs, to be able to challenge government directly, week in, week out, on the key things that really matter to people: the need to tax wealth fairly, the need to oppose the cruel cuts to benefits, the cruel continuation of the two-child benefit cap, the cruel cutting of the aid budget and putting that money into buying more weaponry. These are things that Greens have been incredibly outspoken on in Parliament, and of course, holding the government to account over their complicity in the genocide in Gaza. We have built a Green Party over the past 50 years, standing on the shoulders of giants. I've been involved for 10 years. Adrian's been involved for 25 plus, knowing that it's crucial to have a strong Green voice in politics. That is the job of the Green Party, to connect to the voices of protest movement outside and bring them into politics, show that there's a better way, push forward those policies for building a fairer, greener country. The housing that's built to standards that stop people having to waste money on energy that just goes out the doors and windows, that keeps people warm at affordable prices. The transport system that helps us all to get where we need to without being reliant on private cars and the dirty fossil fuel industries. And of course, that concern for tackling the climate crisis is absolutely at the centre of green politics, and is why we, as an independent green voice, are such a crucial part of the political debate now. We have, over those years, shifted politics to recognise the reality that environmental, social, and economic justice are completely interlinked. That strong green voice at the centre of politics, at the centre of our councils, and now increasingly on the biggest political platform in the country, in Westminster, is so crucial. Adrian and I know what it means to bring together the widest possible team of activists, of campaigners, to help us win in the grossly unfair political system that we currently have of first past the post. We know that the Green Party needs to be able to reach out to the widest possible range of people. And that's what we've shown how to do. And that's the leadership that we want to continue to offer the Green Party. Thank you.
Thank you. Zack, your 2 minutes.
I'm not sure who's suggesting that we go back to the old days. There must be a third candidate here that I didn't know about, because actually what I'm looking forward to is the future, which is saying that I've been part of the deputy leadership team that has given us unprecedented success. But I also recognise the success is not nearly what it needs to be. Let's look at the crises we're facing right now. We've got this deeply unpopular Labour government. They're cutting two-child benefit cap, that are treating disabled people, trans people, migrants with the most performative cruelty. That's not just performative, they are actively being cruel. And then we have the genocide in Gaza, in which we're not just complicit, we are active participants. We're arming them, we're sharing intelligence. And when Israel and America bombed Iran illegally, Keir Starmer didn't just not condemn it. In fact, he sent implicit codes that it was fine. So that's the scale of the crises we're facing. And we've got reform on the rise and the far right on the rise. And I'm sick and tired of the Green Party being on the margins. We need to be in the centre. I can't tell you how many times as I go around the country and I go to picket lines, I go to movements, I go to rallies, people say, oh, if you were the leader of the Green Party, I'd join. But the Green Party doesn't seem to be where you're at. You know, you're not a socialist party. You're not a left wing party. You're not a bold party. We are all of those things. And we've been those things for a long time. And by the way, Ellie is those things too. We don't have a difference here. What the difference is, though, is our communication. This leadership race is not about policy. Our members decide the policy. And I love that. It's one member, one vote. Democratic at the conference. So although we can discuss policy, the real difference here is about how we present ourselves, how we talk to the public. So the vote that Green Party members have, and anyone who's not in the Green Party but joins by July 31st if they share with our values, quick plug there, the real choice that anyone has got is, do you recognize the Green Party is getting better? Do you recognize it's getting bolder? But are you ready to put rocket boosters on it? Because what I want to do leading this party is make sure that every single person in this country, not just the millions of people who already agree with us and the nearly 2 million votes we got, but many, many more millions of people say, I am left wing, I am socialist, and the Green Party is my home.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your opening statements. We are going to get into the debate now. The first topic is on leadership. First question for you, Ellie. Do you think it's important that the leadership is also an elected MP?
I do think it's important that our leadership is our MPs, since there's two of us standing, and that's for two really practical reasons. Actually, the first is that Westminster is where the centre of the political conversation is at. Now, when there's a leadership election, obviously there's a bit of a media circus around that, but in normal political times, what is the direction of politics is set in Parliament. That's where everything gets announced, first of all. That's where all of the journalists are hanging around. That's where the big political stories are made day in, day out. And so it's really important that our leadership is there and able to speak on those issues. The minute the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary or whoever stands up in Parliament, we have to be responding, showing our leadership as a party. That's what we do all of the time. And that's why it's so important to have our leadership in Parliament. But there's a second reason as well. And that's because by having MPs at the forefront of our communication, we remind voters all the time that Greens win elections. We remind voters all the time that if they vote Green, they can elect Greens. And that's been one of the crucial things that we've been working on so hard in recent years. We know that we've got popular policies and popular ideas. We know that our polling in the country is far, far higher than our proportion of elected seats. So what we need to do is organise ourselves so that we can translate that already significant support in the country into winning the number of seats that matches to it. If we had a fair electoral system, we would have literally dozens of Green MPs already. The reason we don't, sadly, is because we've got this grossly unfair electoral system, first past the post, in which you need to convince a near majority of the voters, the plurality of the voters, the largest chunk of voters, that if they vote Green, they can elect a Green. That's what we showed how to do in the elections last year. That's how we won our 4 target seats. And that's why I'm so committed to the target to win strategy. And that's why I'm so committed to having leadership that's in Parliament, because every time a Green MP speaks in Parliament on behalf of all of those people who support Green policies across the country, we remind them that if they vote Green, they can get Greens elected.
Zack, I mean, obviously I want to get your response to that. I mean, Ellie and Adrian are making the point that it's important that elected MPs are in leadership, potentially get you more media coverage, potentially. I know you disagree since yourself isn't an MP, so what's your response to Ellie's answer?
Not just me that disagrees, it's the media that disagrees. I don't think anyone cares. I think what they really care about is, do you have something interesting to say and are you cutting through? The reason why Ellie said that there's a media circus around leadership elections is because since this election launched, I've done, I think, nearly 70 interviews now, national interviews, where I've been all over the media. And in fact, I don't think anyone has to imagine that. I had a very weird endorsement today from Michael Gove, who called me incredibly charismatic. I feel a little bit like I need to wash myself after he said that. But my point here really is that even former ministers are noticing the campaign. Now, it wasn't that I launched the leadership campaign and then I started clear about the things we stand for and crucially the things we stand against. I think what the media really equivocation or not entirely knowing the character of a party. And I think the character of the party is really clear. We're a compassionate and but we're a party that are ready to take the fight to fossil fuel companies, to unscrupulous landlords, to the people who are screwing this country over. And I think it's by picking fights, that's exactly how we'll get more media coverage. In terms of being an MP, it's important to say that every election that we've had our most successful results ever were elections where the leadership weren't MPs. And in fact, when Carla and Adrian ran for leadership, their whole ticket was, let's use the platform of leadership to be the future MPs. So what I'd like to do is be in the leadership place, because I'd like to be an MP and have 2 deputy leaders that I'm also going to take to Parliament in a big group of MPs. And then the final thing I'd say, just to respond to Ellie's comments, is I think there's three reasons why we don't have more MPs. One is undoubtedly proportional representation. We know we have an unfair voting system, so we need to get more MPs to change it. So it's a slightly circular argument, and there's no difference here, but we're going to need MPs to get that changed. The second is that the media are unfair to us, and that's absolutely true. Reform have deep pockets, they have GB News, they can be on it whenever they want. But I don't think it's enough for us just to criticize about that. Sure, I moan about it all the time, but actually I think the much bigger thing to do is what are we going to do about it? So this week or last week, I put out a video. It's had over 3 million views now, the video on the beach. That's been consistent when I've been creating social media content that has cut through. But it's not just about my leadership. I want to lead a party that trains people in their local parties, particularly marginalized people from working class backgrounds, people of color, to get even better at social media. Because what we need to be doing is amplifying the stories that are happening in our communities. And that, by the way, is how we're going to send so many more MPs to Parliament next time. But focusing on Parliament, people don't really care what's going on in Parliament. It really matters. I wish people cared, but I think the honest truth, we know from talking to the public that other than Prime Minister's questions times, and even that most people don't notice, it all just kind of washes over in a load of noise. Nigel Farage got Brexit done, and I hated that he did, but he did it outside Parliament. So the idea you have to be inside Parliament is a strange one.
Before we go on to the next question, is there anything you want to say quickly, Ellie? And remember, if either of you hear something you disagree with, feel free to jump in. I'm not going to stop you.
I suppose I don't think it's either or, frankly. I mean, I find it a bit amusing. On the one hand, Zack says it really doesn't matter what happens in Parliament, but he also says he wants to be an MP. Nigel Farage, by the way, was exactly the same and bent over backwards to eventually get elected. There's no contrast between doing really well in Parliament and doing good comms. And I agree that our party's comms needs to step up. And in order to do that, we need to build the credibility, we need to raise the backing, we need to enthuse the members to join us. But I do think in all of those things, it helps to have a leader who's in Westminster. It's not the be all and end all by any means, but it's a little bit inconsistent to kind of say that you want to be in Westminster, but also be so critical of it.
They're two different jobs. I want to be an MP because I want to represent the community that I seek to represent. And I want to go into Parliament. I want to scrutinise legislation. I want to hopefully one day put legislation into law or make legislation into law and be in a Green government. That is different to being leader of a movement. And absolutely, you can do both things, and most parties do. But when you have 4 MPs, I really hear Carla Denyer when she says she wants to step down to focus on being an excellent constituency MP, because Ellie is an incredible constituency MP. I've heard her say, and I've experienced it, that as she goes around the constituency, people recognise her, they recognise the hard work she's doing, and not for a second would I take any of that away from her, nor any of our 4 MPs. But it is a different job to be going around the country, to be on the media, to be on the debate stages and representing the party. And the biggest difference I hear that is in Adrian Ramsey when he got into where there was tension between what he wanted in his constituency and the party. He was on Radio 4 saying, I'm first and foremost a constituency MP. Completely legitimate response. Apart from, I think the party needs someone who is first and foremost a party leader.
I'd just point out that Zack's constituents and the London Assembly might be a little bit surprised because, you're also a full-time London Assembly member in theory, Zack. We've both got full-time jobs, really busy full-time jobs.
London has 10 million constituents, so I think whatever I'm doing, I'm representing my constituents. And actually, when they see me on the national stage, particularly as it's London, by the way, is literally my constituency. So I'm elected under proportional representation. It's London-wide, so literally every single zone in London is my constituency. And I make sure that I do all of my Green Party travelling at weekends, and in the week I'm in City Hall, in the Chamber, and in the evenings I'm often on media. That's all totally balanceable. Parliament is very different. Bells ring, you need to go vote. You have an actual constituency, which is much smaller, where people are expecting to see you in that constituency doing surgeries. London Assembly members don't do surgeries.
What do you think that's something that fundamentally needs to change about the party? I mean, you guys are bringing 2 different things to the table. So what's a fundamental problem or something that really needs to change about the party to really break through?
A fundamental thing that I think needs to change about the party. I mean, I do think we need to sort out our internal systems in all sorts of ways, actually. I mean, one example, kind of a bit funny, I suppose, but, this leadership election is officially 3 months long and has actually been nearly 4 months long for what is officially a 1-year term. And anybody outside the party who hears that thinks it's a little bit extraordinary, really. So I think that, it would be great if we could make ourselves work in a little more agile way as a party, and that applies in a range of ways.
I think we need to be much more rooted in trade union and working class communities. Zara Sultana and Corbyn have launched something that isn't even a party yet, and they've had 500,000 people sign up. I think the party needs to do self-reflection about why are all those people who are signing up not seeing what I think is a very similar vision to the Green Party in the Green Party. I don't believe that's policy based. I don't believe that's about our members. We're doing amazing work, both people who've been in the party decades and the thousands of new members we've had during this internal leadership election. But again, it comes back to communications. I just think far too many people in this country don't know that the Green Party stands for social, racial, environmental, and economic justice. They know we care about the environment. We should never stop caring about the environment. It's crucial. We've got a climate crisis. We're also one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And we know that the inequality crisis exacerbates that climate crisis. It also means that the people who have done the least to cause the climate crisis are the most affected by it. But I think lots of people don't know about our policies around anti-trade union laws, as in not anti-trade union laws, but rolling back the anti-trade union laws and making sure that we're looking to empower workers to make sure that they have fair pay, that they have dignity in the workplace, our policies on protecting the National Health Service, and of course, even things like our wealth tax to tax multimillionaires and billionaires and redistribute that money to help fund our public services. I think all of these policies are things that the public really care about, along with nationalising our water companies because they're pumping sewage into the water, charging us extra for a privilege. No, the Green Party stood for that. So again, we need everyone to know what the Green Party stands for, how we'll grow into a mass member movement.
I mean, you mentioned about a wealth tax there. And obviously, when it comes to the policy platform, Ellie and Zack, you both agree on that. I mean, at the beginning of this, you said this isn't about necessarily policy; it's about leadership. But my question is, Zack, I mean, it's a small amount, right? Isn't the point of inequality to rein in the power of the super rich? So surely a 1 or 2% tax is really nothing. I mean, should billionaires exist, and I'm going to start with you, Zack, but would either of you support a maximum wage?
Yeah, I've said to you before that I think we should abolish billionaires. It's also Green Party policy to have a 1 in 10 ratio, meaning that if you're in an organization, whoever the lowest paid is should not be earning 10 times less than the person with the maximum wage. Now, we have to represent Green Party policy. And so whenever we say something that's different to Green Party policy, we have to point that out. And so I am going to point that out. I think there's probably a case to be made that even that is too generous. When you do the figures to see someone earning 10 times more than the lowest paid, I think there probably is a conversation to be had about that. With the wealth tax, though, I think what we're establishing at the beginning here is the principle. So the idea that, so for instance, when you talk about wealth tax, there's lots of different kind of components to that. So the one that we talk about most often is assets. So a 1% 1% tax on assets of £10 million or more, or a 2% tax on assets of £2 billion or more. Now, other countries have tried bigger wealth taxes kind of straight off, and there are legitimate kind of evidence that because they cast the net too wide, it meant that it was less efficient, as opposed to going, we're going to go with a narrow focus here. So the people employed to make sure that the super rich are actually paying these taxes properly, and potentially creating an exit tax. So if they try and take their asset out of the country, which is very difficult to do anyway, but they pay on that exit tax. But there's other policies too, like bringing capital gains tax in line with income tax. That means we'd be taxing unearned wealth as much as earned income. It strikes people as really unfair right now that a cleaner or a nurse could be paying more tax than the building owner of the building that they're working in. Like, that's completely disproportionate. But I think more widely, there's a whole conversation to have around the economy. And actually, taxation is not the only way to fund public services. And in fact, I think when you dig down into it, it's not a way to fund public services at all. But all of these things are easy shortcuts to having a conversation. So I think winning the argument right now, and we're not alone in this. We've got the amazing Gary Stevenson, for instance, who I talk to a lot about this. Winning kind of the central narrative on principle and value that the super rich should be paying a bit more, so people aren't living in poverty, is the first argument to win. Then how you do it and the nuts and bolts of then how fair it is, I think, is the next conversation. But you've got to win the first step first.
Yeah. So on the last point, maximum wage, yes, the Green Party has this policy of a maximum 10-to-1 wage ratio, and I strongly support that. Inequality, I think, is at the root of every problem. And we really have to tackle both income inequality and wealth inequality. It's really interesting to kind of be challenged on, oh my goodness, is the wealth tax proposal that we're making too weak, when I'm honestly fed up with going on mainstream radio programs and so forth, and people saying, "Oh my goodness, all the billionaires will leave the country. What on earth will we do?" And I think, that's just such a misunderstanding of basic economics and why people live in places, and also of the net benefits that we would have from the tax that we're proposing. So our manifesto proposed a 1% tax on assets over 10 million, 2% on assets over a billion. Tax Justice UK, Patriotic Millionaires, great organisations, they've put out recent reports saying, well, a 2% tax on over 10 million would generate 24 billion a year, which could make a really significant contribution to public services. At the same time, we've got to recognise that public expenditure is something like 1,000, I'm going to trip over my numbers here, aren't I?
Don't
Something
worry,
like
it's in the
1,000.
mainstream media where we try and catch you out.
That's a huge amount of money, and of course the main sources of funding for public services are the bigger taxes that cover everybody, income tax and so forth. Now, I think there's a really kind of interesting conversation to be had about tax that I wish we would have as a country, a more nuanced conversation about tax. And I've had this really often in village halls in my local area, for example, and with people on the doorstep. I knocked on the door of a guy the other day who was doing very well for himself, thank you. And he said, "You're not doing anything for the working man. I'm voting reform because I don't want to pay any tax." Basically, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but that was his perspective. Whereas my perspective on taxes, it's how we all chip into a pot to pay for the things that we can't buy individually in the market. And there are so many of those things. You can have a really narrow view of it, law and order and defence and so forth, or a more expansive view of it, of public services, or an even more expansive view of it, of a society in which everybody has what they need to live a decent life. And I think that is something that actually everybody wants to share. Nobody wants to live in a country where there are people on the streets, kids being raised in poverty, and yet we are living in just such a society. And at the same time, many people have this sense of taxation is an unjust thing, and that's because the tax system as a whole is organised so unfairly. Council tax, for example, is a grossly unfair tax, whereby people in a normal house somewhere in the north of the country are paying more than people living in an absolute mansion somewhere like Kensington. So there's a real kind of bigger conversation that we need to be having about tax, rooted, I think, in this understanding that it's how we all chip in to build a country that serves everybody, where everybody's got both the services and the support they need to live a good life, and a recognition that inequality is bad in itself. That inequality of income, inequality of wealth, inequality of status. I would like us to be a society where we've got much stronger sense of we genuinely are all in this together, not in the clapping for the NHS at the time of COVID sense, but actually really all in this together. And that would mean a much more equal society than we have now.
It's interesting you mentioned that person you spoke to on the doorstep who was voting for reform, because I think there's a lot of people out there who are disillusioned with the political system, and they feel like reform is sort of their shot to sort of, I don't know, bringing it down in a way. And I also think a lot of people say we're paying too much taxes. Does that mean for either of you, is there any scope that you would look at cutting taxes for the lowest income people? Or do you think actually that's a policy that shouldn't be looked at because we should only be looking at raising taxes, but obviously specifically on the rich?
First of all, I agree with Ellie that inequality is at the heart of everything. I would cheekily say that Adrian argued on LBC when I said that I was being simplistic. So anyway, I'm glad we're all raising our comms levels. But yes, to this question, I think I actually agree entirely with Ellie on this in terms of I think we need to win the argument about taxes. And that is going to be very difficult, particularly with people who are particularly poor and in working industries where they're working with their hands or even their brains, rather than the super rich who are just often living off their assets and making more money in their sleep while the rest of us are all working hard. So I think there's no way you could turn to the country right now, and nor should you, and say to working people, or by the way, people who aren't, are out of work as well. I think they're important in this conversation too. The idea that they should pay more tax, because that would clearly be unfair. But I think this does link to the net zero conversation, because we have a climate crisis. We need to reduce our emissions. We also need to do climate adaptation as well as mitigate. But we know the way the government is doing net zero far too often does fall on people having to get an electric car or a heat pump. And actually, what we need to be doing so much more is always subsidizing the greenest option to make sure it's the cheapest, the most accessible, and the most convenient. And I think the most obvious example of this is I was going to go to Sheffield the other day and I was booking a train late and I ended up not going, or in fact, I jumped in a car share because the train was going to be nearly £200 return. Now, I genuinely think I didn't, but if I'd looked at getting a plane from London up north, it might even have been cheaper than that. And that's because at the moment we subsidize jet fuel on aviation, despite the fact that domestic flights are such a climate injustice for those people, particularly private jets, where super rich are just polluting the environment. Whereas a train, what should be the cheapest, greenest option, is far too often the most expensive. Now, all of that just sounds like the way it is, but actually it's all the result of political choices, and we can make different political choices. So that's a long way round of coming back to your answer. But the point is, in time, I do think we need to make the argument that actually, yes, more tax into our system across the entire board, like most countries in Western Europe, is a healthy and positive thing. But right now, when the government are making such awful decisions, I think the idea of turning to the poorest people in this country and asking them to pay a bit more makes absolutely no sense, which is why I think a lot of the focus right now, rightly, is tax for rich.
So because in their manifesto, Reform, they wanted to cut taxes, and that those that paid, what was it, £20,000 a year or earned £20,000 a year or less didn't pay any taxes. You're saying that is not the way to go, and I know you've already had. I mean, is that correct? By the way,
no, because there's a much more nuanced conversation to this, which is tax does not pay for our public services.
Yeah.
And actually, there's lots of other ways of doing that. And I just come back to, anything we can do, we can afford. And actually, if we were actually investing in this country, in the infrastructure and capital infrastructure, if we were creating the jobs, if we were making sure, particularly around the green transition, we had that better vision of what better looks like, then tax is not the way to go immediately anyway, and certainly not on working people. So I really resent what Reform are saying there, especially when we count some of them, 80% of their budget is on adult social care. And we know that decades of austerity have absolutely devastated this country. So I don't think putting taxes up for anyone at the moment who can't afford it, or that's a very tenuous term, but shouldn't have to afford it, is not the way to go.
Ellie, same question here. I mean, do you think that Reform sort of looking at tax cuts for the lowest sort of income, people earning a low income, is actually a very, very bad policy, and it's something the Green Party shouldn't be looking at?
First of all, I would say that basically I wouldn't believe a word Reform says about anything. It's not worth the paper that it's written on. I've sat in the chamber with them when they've been talking absolute rubbish about all sorts of things, and it's kind of quite interesting that you look at what happens when the Green Party puts out a policy. There's all this, is it fully costed? Actually, yes, our policies are fully costed. Our manifesto is absolutely fully costed. When Reform puts out something that's going to cost the country, £80 billion, and they've got zero idea where that money's going to come from, somehow they get a free pass. When they put out this ridiculous kind of golden visa scheme that's going to cost literally billions, somehow again, they get a free pass. So that is, there is a real failure to scrutinise what Reform are talking about with that. On the fundamental point of should people on lower incomes be paying more tax? No, absolutely not. Fundamentally, we've got a problem of inequality. And one of the ways that we even that up is by supporting those who are on the lowest incomes and getting those on the highest incomes and with the highest wealth to pay more, to contribute more. And that's what's crucial about this discussion about wealth taxes, because we used to, decades ago, we had a situation where income tax was up much, much higher than it is. The high levels of income tax were much, much higher than they are now. But we've really got to have this conversation about wealth tax, because fundamentally that income has been recycled into wealth, and then people can sit on it and, get a great deal of income without having to do anything much in the way of actual labouring. At the same time, I think we do need a really nuanced conversation about this. I'm a bit distrustful, to be perfectly honest, of this kind of 99% versus the 1%. People on the 99th percentile are people like NHS consultants. So we've got to be kind of subtle about the conversation about people who are making a kind of real contribution to public services and to the country, and people who are arguably not. I think also for me, I'd want to look at the model of somewhere like, Denmark, the Nordic countries, where they have a model where there is considerably more raised in tax from the population as a whole, but not from those at the lower end of the income scale. So the taxation burden is much more kind of fairly distributed, and it's much more progressive, essentially. And an obvious example of where we should be doing that in the UK, and we talked about this at the time of the general election as well, is national insurance. I mean, effectively, it's quite interesting. In the UK, we've got income tax and then we've got national insurance that we nominally treat as separate, but then we put it all into the same pot. And you could make an argument about actually that should just all be integrated and have a much clearer system around that. But we've got this system where at the lower end of the income scale, you pay a higher proportion of your income as national insurance than you do on the portion that's over about £55,000 a year. Why is that? Why is it that people on higher incomes are paying a lower proportion of their income as tax, even on just normal wages? So I think we really need quite nuanced and subtle discussions about tax. I'd like us to have a much bigger conversation as a society about tax, not only to get to that kind of common understanding of it's how we can chip into that pot to pay for the things that are valuable, but also to just get a better understanding of all the different ways that we do pay tax. VAT is a huge tax that the burden falls hardest on those with the lowest incomes because we pay a higher proportion of our income on it. And yet it's rarely part of the conversation at all. So I do think we need, much more in-depth and nuanced conversations about tax founded on this basic principle of building a fairer society. And, that's at the centre of green politics, a fairer and a greener country.
What Ellie's saying there is really interesting and a nuanced conversation that I'd love to have too. And I think it's a conversation that Parliament should be having. I also think it's a conversation podcasts like this should be having, where your audience are largely very politically engaged, very, very interested. There's other aspects to this too, for instance, like the Bank of England and their so-called quantitative tightening, where we could quantitative ease. Right now, we are paying interest on the amount of money that we lent to corporate banks. And actually, we don't need to be doing that. And just removing that entirely, I think it was estimated between 30 to 50 billion pounds. Interestingly, the person who I see making the argument most commonly is so I think there's ways to make that argument, but I think all of these things lose the public and they are different to communication. So when I come back to the 99% versus the 1%, what I'm really talking about there is a unifying message, which is not about the details of the policy or the research, which I think is how we lose people, but actually it's about the narrative. It's about the storytelling and the emotive storytelling. Now, it's not a lie. I think it's undoubtedly true that working class people who run small businesses, and yes, even consultants in the NHS share so much more in common than when we get to that 1% who are talking about a tiny group of people who are running the media, who are controlling the narratives, who are demonizing migrants. And actually, I think we need to recognize that's where the villain is. The villain is Shell. The villain is the people in this country, like BlackRock, they're not even in this country, but in the world, who through global capital are absolutely squeezing everybody else and creating the inequality that's in our society. Now, would that rhetoric go easily into legislation? No, and nor should it. That should be about the detail and the research and make sure everything stands up to scrutiny. But communicating is a very different thing. And I think being able to point at the 1% and say the migrants, the trans people who are disabled, they are not your issue here. The issue here are these people who are screwing us over.
Ellie, did you want to quickly respond 30 seconds before I move on from economic policy?
Yeah, just briefly on that. I mean, on the language of the 99% versus the 1%, I am not convinced that is language that appeals to a wide range of people. We know it's language that appeals to the kind of progressive activist section of the population. And yeah, of course, I'm in that section myself. I've spent my entire life being an activist. But it's not the language that appeals to the large majority of people in the country. And I know that from knocking on doors across the country. I think when we're facing in Reform UK, a political party that is leaning in to polarisation, we do face a choice about whether we ourselves also lean into polarisation and dig into speaking only to people who already agree with us, or whether we channel a different sort of politics and speak in a way that is more inclusive, that people can connect with more easily. So there will always be a significant chunk of people who are appealed to by that messaging. But there's a much wider chunk of people who recognise that all of us are kind of complicit and kind of integrated into all of these systems of the way that our society works at the moment. And they want a message of how we can shift to a different way of doing things in a way that isn't so simplifying that they distrust it.
Zack, not too long ago, the Supreme Court ruled that men, women refers to biological sex, not gender, leading to policies such as people having to go to the toilet that match their gender assigned at birth rather than their current identity. Do you support the Supreme Court decision, or do you disagree with it?
So I'm going to wedge what I was about to say into also answering this question because I think they do connect. We're already an incredibly polarized society and we are divided. And I know that from knocking on doors. I also know that the 99% message is a very unifying message. I ultimately want to polarize ourselves from the 1% because we are already polarized from them. So I think it's about how do we bring people together. Now, there are two different ways of doing that. We've got the Lib Dem model, which is to tell people what they want to hear at the local level, win MPs, but then when you have 72 MPs, not really have a coherent narrative or a real way of changing the country. Or you have a much more principled way, which is to say, yes, we want to go where people are at, but it's not about going just to where they're at. It's bringing people to you. It is winning the arguments. It is about telling powerful stories based on research and science that can bring people and change people's minds. And so when I see Keir Starmer say that he looks at the Supreme Court judgment and it said what it said, so that's his view, that's a complete moral abdication of all responsibility. It's also a ridiculous, incoherent, cruel position to take, because ultimately Keir Starmer and the MPs and anyone involved in politics, their job essentially is to change the law or to scrutinise or to legislate. And so the Supreme Court has to rule based on what legislators have made. But that does not mean that legislators cannot take a different point of view. And we know, particularly when I think you gave me the toilet example there, that the kind of corollary of that, of a logical argument that would later on happen, is that someone who is now a trans woman would have to be in the cis women's toilet. I get confused because this is how incoherent the entire thing is, because actually I think people just want to pee in peace. And I don't think we should have people at the door inspecting people's genitalia. I also think that trans rights are human rights. A trans man is a man, a trans woman is woman, and non-binary identities already and do exist. And ultimately what we need to do as politicians is show unconditional solidarity to marginalized groups, particularly trans people, who are far more likely to be the victims of violence. And we know the argument that is often used is around women's rights, and there is still a huge amount to do around women's rights. But we also know that huge amount to do is about dealing with the gender pay gap, tackling violence against women and girls, making sure that women can get a gynecology appointment, all the things that are already exacerbated by inequality. But those are all the problems of a sexist structural institutions that are all set up that way, largely by cis men. The problem here is not trans people.
Ellie, the same question. What's your response to the Supreme Court ruling?
I'm honestly really concerned about the implications of the Supreme Court ruling. I've had, a number of my trans constituents, trans women and trans men, come to see me in the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling and kind of explain this is madness. Trans women saying, I've used women's toilets for years, and now what I'm being told that I can't. And I think that is insane. I think trans people should be able to use the toilets of their gender identity. And yeah, I completely agree. Nobody should be inspecting genitalia. And of course, that's completely ridiculous. I think we struggle as a society. This is one of the issues we struggled as a society to talk about. And I think it's hugely worrying that trans people face so much discrimination and marginalisation. And the Green Party has had this really important role, I think, in standing up for trans rights, defending trans people's rights to live free of fear, to live with dignity, with respect, to have their fundamental human rights respected. And I'm really proud of that record that the Green Party has got, and I really stand by it. I think there are some areas, for example, trans people's participation in sport, questions around prisons, accommodation, where there have been questions raised, and there do need to be conversations had about complex issues. But that is not that is not anything to do with questioning a trans person's right to exist or a trans woman's right to be treated as a woman, a non-binary person's right to be treated in line with their gender identity. I absolutely affirm that. And I really am horrified by the way that trans rights have been attacked and the way that individuals have been attacked in horrifying ways by the right wing press, by right wing politicians, denying people's lived reality, denying people's right to live in the gender identity they they inhabit. And so I think that it's really important that the Green Party has that strong record of defending trans people's rights.
I do hate it when the mainstream media sort of like really tries to use this as a wedge issue. What I do have to say is that some people have pointed out that Adrian Ramsey, who obviously you're running with, didn't explicitly agree that or disagree that trans women are women and trans men are men. Are trans women women and are trans men men? And do you also believe in gender self-ID? Sorry.
You're absolutely right, Curtis. That is always used as this kind of gotcha question. I've got a very clear answer to that. Trans women are women socially, should be treated in the gender identity that they live in. Absolutely. Biology is different. There's a difference between gender and sex. That's, I don't think, a contested position. And so, in some circumstances, biological sex, should be taken into account in deciding, for example, participation in certain levels of certain women's sports, for example. And I think those decisions, personally, I think those decisions should be made by the governing bodies of those respective sports. So there's a distinction between sex and gender, but I always do and believe we all should treat a trans woman as a woman, treat a trans man as a man. And of course, we don't always know if somebody's trans. So, yeah.
But as a policy, though, in terms of self-ID, is that something you think the Green Party should absolutely support?
I support self-ID, absolutely. In its social terms, self-ID for gender. There is a distinction between gender and sex.
Zack, same questions to you, and if you had a quick response.
Yeah, the reason why I put my hand up initially wasn't to respond to Ellie, it was actually to tell a very brief story that I heard yesterday, and I promised I would tell it when I had a microphone, and I guess I've got a microphone now. So there's a young cis woman who works for the Green Party, and she was leaving one of our offices, and she's cis, but people started to shout transphobic abuse at her. She was on her bike, obviously clearly very upset about this, cycled off, and some boys kind of almost followed her. Anyway, it was just this horrific story. One, it was horrific just as a woman to experience any kind of intimidation, but two, she just really reflected on it and said to me, when you have a microphone, please do share this story, because actually this is the consequence of all of these conversations that are happening from the mainstream media and particularly the right-wing press, because actually what it's pushing us into is sorry, the boys are about, she said, about 15 as well. So this is a group of young 15-year-old boys whose first kind of reach is to reach to transphobic abuse. The second thing I was going to say was just the research that came out last week that showed how much fossil fuel companies were absolutely embedded within the gender critical movement. And I just think that's an important thing for people to know about, because when this is a wedge issue, to recognize that particularly when organizations or more newspapers constantly push at the Green Party on this issue, the Green Party obviously being the foremost party who's challenging these fossil fuel companies, I think people should ask questions about why is this constantly coming up. I was on Jeremy Vine the other day. He asked me, what is a woman? I answered. And then to come back to my 99% answer, my second part of my answer, which is I think stolen from either AOC or Bernie Sanders, which was trans people also need to buy eggs. They need to get to work. They need to pay for transport. They are the 99%. And that was my point about the 99% versus the 1%, that I think we need to get back to inequality, and that affects trans people even worse, rather than these conversations about what genitalia is between someone's legs. Finally, to answer your question, I absolutely support self-ID. And in terms of the Equality Act, that already gives space to say if there's a very specific reason that we should go on a case-by-case basis. But I don't think that's anything to do with the gender of someone. I think that, across anything, that a dangerous person is a dangerous person. But I think what is really insipid is the implication. I'm not suggesting Ellie was doing this. I'm talking more widely. The implication that a trans person is in any way more of a threat or any threat at all to a community, as opposed to what we know the real threat is disproportionately, which is cis men.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room. There is a new political party which doesn't have a name yet, which is headed by Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn. What's your view on that, and would you work with them?
Yeah, I don't think it's an elephant in the room. I've actually got to the point where I'm really excited because you look at Keir Starmer and you go, why are two parties, or one party as in the Green Party and a non-party yet, already surging? And it's because Keir Starmer has created such a huge space to the left. So actually, I think any of us on the left and socialists need to go, um, how do we make sure that this moment is not lost? How do we make sure in this moment we grab the kind of it was what I was talking about before about not being a weather vane but being a signpost, and actually going, this is the moment where we know people are upset, we know that inequality is destroying our communities, corporations are destroying our communities, they're destroying our environment, and they're destroying our democracy, and it's time to fight back. And I think anyone who wants to fight back with the Green Party is ultimately people that we need to ally with, and find ways to work together. So on one hand, the Green Party, I would still always say, is the best place to do this. We got nearly 2 million votes. We've got 39 second place finishes, over 800 councillors. And respectfully, we're not having conferences about what our name is. Like, that's really, really starting from the very beginning and working up. And it's not for me to tell anyone else what to do. So if people want to do that, then I literally support them in that. But also go, if that starts to seem like a distraction, or if that seems like it's going to take a very long time when we recognize we have racist riots on our streets and we've got people trying to threaten or are threatening people in hotels, asylum seekers, then it's probably time to join the Green Party and make sure that the momentum we've got, we build even further. We've got an internal election race right now where I'm standing on a very explicit ticket of saying, I stand with you. I want the Green Party to be bolder about being a left-wing socialist party, that anyone who aligns with our values should join and get involved. And so all of that is on the table. But ultimately, if we can't win that argument, then I think we need to go, what does cooperation look like? And ultimately, that will be a decision for our members. But I think we need to reach this moment with an open heart, recognize that we stand so much better working with what we have in common, than being divided. And also recognizing that if 500,000 people sign up, you should probably go, well, why were 500,000 people not signing up with us, and what are we doing wrong? And that doesn't mean we need to chuck the baby out with the bathwater. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily doing anything wrong, but it means we're not being loud enough, we're not being effective enough, we're not communicating clearly enough. And so I think the self-reflection for me and for the entire party to go, what do we do to make sure that everyone knows that if they're on the left of politics, their home should be in the Green Party?
Ellie, I mean, Zack not only said that you probably work with him, he even sounds excited. A couple of your and agent's press releases suggested that you're not as open potentially, and also your press releases criticised this new party of not talking about the climate enough. So my question is the same to you really, is would you be open, if you were leading the Green Party with Adrian Ramsey, to open up and work with this new party to take on, obviously, Labour and Reform?
Cooperation with anybody that we've got common ground with is in the DNA of the Greens. You know, we always have done that. When I was a member of the European Parliament, we were cooperating across parties. I'd like to work in a political system, a proportional political system, where cooperation is kind of embedded into the system. So cooperation isn't the thing that's in question here. I mean, I have to be really honest, just kind of looking on at this process of the launching of a new party, it's not been the sort of thing that would inspire confidence, in my opinion. It's been a bit fits and starts, hasn't it? They haven't even got a name yet. There's clearly underlying it some tension around leadership and things like that. And so I'm interested to see what happens. Zara and Jeremy are both people with whom, we've often voted the same way in Parliament, and, had perfectly cooperative conversations in Parliament about political issues. But in terms of the launch of the new party, I mean, it's interesting that they've got lots of sign-ups on their website. At the same time, I would say, well, nobody's had to pay anything to sign up on their website. And if I was them, I would be a little bit worried that it was lots of people signing up so that they could vote, to call the party Voting McVoteface or something like that. There's a real kind of, we can't assume what people are signing up for with their sign-ups there. So it's going to be interesting. Wherever there's common ground, between the Green Party and others. Of course, we want to cooperate. It's far too early. Some journalists have started asking me about, would you have an electoral alliance with them? Well, it's not even a political party yet. Let's see how things go. And like I say, and in fact, like Zack has said, to anybody who does want an existing, highly functional, very organised, really successful political party that stands for all of those things that Jeremy and Zara have been talking about, and is much stronger about tackling the climate and nature crisis, and is really explicit about changing our political system so that every single person's vote counts equally, then they should join the Green Party.
Out of the two of you, Ellie, you did reference about electoral alliances. The party isn't fully set up yet, but for both of you, when this happens, not just about working together on a particular policy or anything, but would either of you be open to some form of electoral alliance where the Green Party and this new party can outpoll Labour, for example?
To be really clear, the Green Party has taken part in electoral alliances in previous elections a couple of cycles ago. Now, that was for those reasons. Then at the last election, we stood absolutely everywhere. And I would like us to stand absolutely everywhere at the next election. I don't rule out in principle cooperation with parties where we have enough in common. It's too early to say which party or parties that might be at the next election. And fundamentally, if it's a party that doesn't stand on the principle of one of every person's vote counts equally. Jeremy Corbyn led the Labour Party for a number of years and never did anything about proportional representation. That's a really fundamental point of difference between his perspective and the Green Party's perspective. So I never rule out cooperation in principle, but the details of it is something that's got to be looked at much further down the road where we see where things are. And fundamentally, my job, my role, my commitment is to building the strongest possible Green Party and getting the maximum possible number of Greens elected.
Zack?
So I agree that there are fundamental things we need to know about this new party, but from everything I know about Jeremy Corbyn, I'd be very surprised if this initiative wasn't having climate and nature partly at the centre of it, or certainly through a similar lens.
But Zack, really sorry, but you joined the Green Party instead of joining Jeremy Corbyn's Labour. So why are you arguing that now?
Because there's a whole history of the Labour Party that I think is incredibly problematic, and has always been problematic, and I thought was problematic under Jeremy Corbyn. And what you described as messy, I think, is actually really refreshing. So I think the fact they don't have a name and they're going to be so fully democratic about it, I think is messy. But I think in the Green Party, we're the experts at knowing what a messy process looks like that is fully democratic, but actually results in a better result at the end. Now, that's not me saying that they will come up with a better result. It's not me saying that they will have policies that I agree with. But I don't think the fact that it's a democratic, messy process, it seems odd to me as a Green Party. My real problem that I've always had with the Labour Party, including under Jeremy Corbyn, although it wasn't coming from Jeremy Corbyn as far as I understand, but the people around him, was the top-down authoritarian nature of not listening to the members and not allowing people to have a messy process because they were always trying to control things. It was interesting to hear Jeremy Corbyn call the Labour Party today, I think, or yesterday, full of control freaks, because that was my observation and still is my observation of the Labour Party for a long time. I think in terms of what is this party going to stand for, I think, in terms of being open to working together, it's not a blank check. If they come up with awful policies or there's people involved like George Galloway, that would be enough for me to go, no, I'm not going near there for a second. But if they are advocating for a wealth tax, proper action on the climate crisis, and yes, I agree with Ellie, proportional representation, I think has to be a fundamental principle, then I think that's enough to start going, okay, let's at least have a conversation here. The phrase about electoral alliances is very complicated for all the reasons Ellie pointed out, and I think it would be foolhardy to start negotiating now, particularly because the leadership aren't the people who do it. In terms of it is up to our membership where we stand and where we don't stand. What I would say is every election where we haven't stood, particularly at local elections, I get hundreds of messages from people all up and down the country, and this has happened in the last few years, where they say, I saw you or I saw Carla or whoever it is on a podcast or an interview, you're really excited to vote Green for the first time, and then there was no Green on the ballot. And that really upsets people, and it feels undemocratic, and it upsets me too. So my first instinct is that if there is a party, which there is, the Green Party, who are saying we want proportional representation, we want to tackle the climate crisis, we want a wealth tax, we want to work with the trade unions, we want to keep our NHS in public hands, all of these policies that I'm really excited and proud about, then I think my first instinct as well is to go, well, actually, why are you standing against us if you believe in all of those things too? Where the conversation becomes interesting is, why are you standing against us? What is the point of difference? And I think the point of difference is where that conversation is going to get more interesting. But right now, I'm not hearing what the difference is. So I think that's, why I've said several times I'd be open to working with them, but let's see the details.
Okay, we are going to leave it there. Really good discussion. When again, remind viewers, when is the date to sign up to become a Green Party member to vote in the election? When's the deadline?
July 31st.
July 31st. So anyone watching, remember to sign up and become a Green Party member by the 31st of July, and you can choose who you want to lead the party. Thank you so much to both of you. I really appreciate your time, and good luck on the campaign trail.